The words came out of Laurel Voss's mouth like she hadn't even thought about them first. Honestly, people like him shouldn't even be allowed in here. She said it to her assistant, but she said it loud, loud enough for the man 2 tables over to hear, loud enough for his daughter, maybe 6 years old, sitting across from him with a juice box and a grilled cheese, to look up from her drawing. The restaurant wasn't fancy. It was the kind of place in downtown Calgary where the lunch specials were written on a chalkboard and the chairs didn't match. But Laurel Voss had a way of making any room feel like it belonged to her and no one else. The man she was talking about was named Tate Drummond. He was sitting in a booth by the window in a pair of worn Carhartt pants and a jacket that had seen too many winters. His hands were rough in the way that hands get when you work with them every day, not dirty, just marked. The kind of marks that don't wash off. He'd come straight from the salvage yard he ran on the east side of the city, a place called Drummond Recovery, where he and 2 other guys spent their days pulling parts off decommissioned military vehicles and selling what could still be used. He heard her. Of course he heard her, but he looked at his daughter instead. Her name was Blythe. She was 6.5, and she had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's habit of chewing on the end of her pencil when she was thinking hard about something. Right now she was drawing a horse. She was always drawing horses, and she looked up at the woman in the cream blazer with the kind of open, uncomplicated curiosity that only children have before the world teaches them to look away. "Daddy," Blythe said, not quietly, "what does she mean?" Tate reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Eat your lunch, Peanut." But what did she? "Grilled cheese is getting cold." Blythe looked at him for a moment the way kids do when they know they're being redirected, but can't yet articulate why. Then she picked up her sandwich. Tate didn't look at Laurel Voss again. He finished his coffee. He paid the bill in cash. He helped Blythe into her coat, and he held her hand on the way out, and when they pushed through the glass door onto the sidewalk, the cold air off the Bow River hit them both, and Blythe pressed herself against his leg. He drove her back to school. He watched her run through the gate without looking back. She never looked back, that kid, always moving forward, and then he sat in his truck for a while with the engine running. He wasn't angry. He'd been angrier at things that mattered less. He was just tired of it. Laurel Voss had been the regional VP of acquisitions for Heartfelt Infrastructure for 4 years, and in those 4 years she had become exactly the kind of person she'd told herself she'd never be when she was 22 and idealistic and working her first job out of Queens. She knew it somewhere underneath everything. She filed that knowledge in the same drawer she filed other uncomfortable things. Her mother's voicemails, the name of the physiotherapist she kept meaning to book, and she kept that drawer shut. She was good at her job. That part was true. She could read a balance sheet the way other people read novels, and she had an instinct for which properties were worth fighting for and which ones would become somebody else's liability. Heartfelt trusted her. Her team feared her in the particular way that people fear someone who is rarely wrong. What she was less good at was stopping to ask whether being right was always the point. The property that had brought her to that particular lunch meeting was parcel of industrial land on the eastern edge of the city, 42 acres. Decent road access, rail spur already in place, proximity to the logistics corridor that Heartfelt wanted to anchor a new distribution hub to. On paper, it was straightforward. In practice, there was a problem. The problem was Drummond Recovery. Tate Drummond had a lease on the southern third of that parcel. 19 years left on it. His operation wasn't large. 2 full-time employees, a rotating contract worker, a corrugated metal building that had been standing since the 80s. But it was legitimate. He had contracts. He had history with the landowner. And he had, as her legal team had explained to her 3 times now, rights that couldn't simply be walked around. Laurel had dealt with complications before. She'd bought out stubborn leaseholders. She'd negotiated relocations. She'd waited people out. She was not particularly worried about Tate Drummond. She didn't know anything about him except that he ran a salvage yard, and he clearly couldn't afford to eat anywhere better than a lunch counter on 8th Avenue. She went back to the office after lunch and told her assistant to draft a relocation offer. Below market. She figured he'd take it. Tate had taken over Drummond Recovery from his uncle 7 years ago, 2 years after he got out of the service. Before that, he'd spent 12 years as a logistics officer with the Canadian Armed Forces. The kind of role that sounds administrative until you understand what it actually means, which is that you are the person responsible for moving people and equipment through places where the wrong decision costs lives. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan. He'd been in Kandahar when the forward operating base took mortar fire and the convoy route collapsed, and the only way out required improvising a solution at 3 in the morning with 4 hours of sleep and a radio that kept cutting out. He didn't talk about any of that. Not at dinner parties, not to the guys at the yard, not even to his daughter, who was too young anyway. He talked about it sometimes at night, in the particular way that people who carry things talk about them, which is that he didn't talk about it at all. But it lived in the way he stood, and the way he planned, and the way he always knew where the exits were. He'd left the service for reasons that were his own. His wife, Kara, had been sick for the last 2 years of his last posting, and when she died, 6 weeks before Blythe turned 2, he'd taken compassionate leave and never gone back. Not because he couldn't, because Blythe needed someone who was present, not someone who was always half somewhere else, and he'd made a choice. His uncle's salvage yard had been the answer he hadn't expected. It turned out that the same instincts that made him good at logistics made him good at running a recovery operation, knowing what was worth salvaging, what had to be let go, how to move things efficiently with limited resources. He'd built it steadily. He wasn't rich. He wasn't trying to be. He was building something that would still be standing when Blythe was old enough to understand what it meant to build something. The letter from Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday. Tate read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and went back out to the yard where one of his guys was elbow-deep in a diesel engine, and he stood there for a while watching the work get done. "Everything okay, boss?" the guy asked without looking up. "Yeah," Tate said. "Fine." He called a lawyer that evening after Blythe was asleep. The meeting was Laurel's idea. She preferred to do these things in person. It was harder for people to be unreasonable when they were sitting across a table from you. Or so she'd always found. She booked a boardroom at Hartwell's downtown tower and sent the details to Drummond's lawyer, and on a Thursday morning in late February, she walked in with her legal counsel and her acquisitions director and a folder of documents she'd prepared herself. Tate came alone. He was wearing the same kind of clothes he'd been wearing at the restaurant, clean but not corporate. He sat down across from her and he didn't say anything, just looked at her with a kind of settled attention that she found, for reasons she couldn't immediately name, slightly unnerving. "Mr. Drummond," she said, keeping her voice pleasant. "Thank you for coming in." "Sure," he said. She laid out the offer. It was better than the first letter. She'd had her team revise it upwards slightly, anticipating that he'd push back. She explained the timeline, the relocation package, the assistance Hartwell was prepared to offer in finding a comparable site. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "I'm not interested." She smiled. "I understand that's your initial reaction. These decisions take time." "It's not an initial reaction," he said. "I have a 19-year lease. I have contracts with D&D that are tied to this location. I have 2 employees whose families depend on this operation running. I'm not interested in relocating." She kept her expression neutral. "The offer is quite generous given the current market." "The offer is what you think you can get away with," Tate said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. "I looked at comparable sites within the logistics corridor. There are 2. Both have waiting lists and neither has rail access. You're not offering me a comparable situation. You're offering me the end of what I've built." Laurel looked at him across the table. He wasn't performing, wasn't angry, wasn't playing a role. He was just telling her what was true. She found that more difficult to deal with than theatrics. "We could explore a phased timeline," her acquisitions director offered. "I'm not looking for a phased timeline," Tate said. He folded his hands on the table. "I'm looking for you to honor the lease." After he left, Laurel stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city and felt something that wasn't quite irritation and wasn't quite respect and didn't have a name she wanted to give it. "He's going to be a problem," her legal counsel said. "I know," she said. She didn't say, "I think he might be right." The next few months were not clean. They were the kind of months that get ground into you. Phone calls from lawyers, counteroffers, a formal response letter that ran to 16 pages and that Tate had clearly written at least in part himself because it had a specificity to it that hired counsel alone wouldn't produce. She found herself reading his words late at night at her kitchen table and thinking, against her will, about the kind of person who writes like that. Precise, no wasted language, no emotion deployed for effect. She sent a second revised offer he declined. She had lunch with her senior VP, who told her to let the lawyers handle it and stop making it personal. She wasn't sure when it had become personal. She wasn't sure she could identify the exact moment. She drove past Drummond Recovery one afternoon. She told herself she was assessing the property for site planning purposes, which was not entirely untrue. It was a gray April day and the yard was busy. She saw Tate moving between vehicles, directing one of his workers, holding a tablet with the unhurried efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. There was a child's drawing taped to the inside of the office window. A horse, she thought, done in pencil. She sat in her car longer than she should have. She drove back to the office and told herself she needed to close this file. The gala was for a veterans support charity, one of those events that Heartfelt sponsored because it was good optics and because some of the partners genuinely cared about it. Laurel went because her name was on the ticket list, and she'd learned long ago that the optics cost more to skip than to attend. It was held in the ballroom of the Fairmont Pallisercer in April, Calgary in the spring, which meant it was 40 degrees outside, and everyone came in from the cold looking slightly bedraggled before they'd even reached the coat check. She was standing at the pre-dinner reception, holding a glass of something sparkling she hadn't actually wanted, talking to a man from the city's urban planning office whose name she'd already forgotten, when she heard someone across the room say, "Drummond." She looked. He was in a dark suit that fit him correctly, and he was standing with a small group near the entrance, and beside him, holding his hand with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who hasn't yet learned that you're not supposed to bring your 6-year-old to formal events, was Blythe. She was wearing a plaid dress and her dark hair was in 2 braids, and she was looking around the ballroom with the focused interest of someone conducting a survey. Laurel watched them for a moment. Blythe tugged on Tate's hand and said something to him, and he bent down to her level to hear it, and whatever she said made him smile. A real one, not a social one, the kind that changes a person's whole face. Laurel felt something move through her that she didn't have a category for. She went and got another drink she didn't want. The dinner proceeded through its usual stages. Speeches, the award presentation, a video package about the charity's work with veterans transitioning to civilian life. She watched the video with more attention than she usually gave to these things. It showed men and women in various stages of rebuilding, working in trades, running small businesses, coaching youth sports. There was a segment about a man who'd started a recycling and recovery operation after 12 years of service, and she watched it and felt the recognition arrive in her chest before her brain had finished processing why. It wasn't Tate, it was someone else, somewhere else, but the shape of the story was the same. 12 years of service, a business built from scratch, a way of taking something most people dismissed and finding the value in it. She set her fork down. After dinner, when the room had broken back into clusters of conversation, she found herself near the back of the hall, closer to where Tate was standing. Blythe was asleep in a chair against the wall, curled up under his jacket. He was talking to a man in full-dress uniform, tall, silver-haired, the kind of bearing that didn't require any explanation, and from the way the uniformed man was leaning in, the conversation was not small talk. Laurel wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the room was quieter back here and she caught fragments. "Never forgot what you did on the Kandahar route. The whole unit came home because of decisions you made that night. Long time ago, sir, not that long. I put it in your file and I'd put it there again." The uniformed man, and she could see now from the insignia, the rank, the particular weight of his presence, was Brigadier General Halloran. She recognized him from the program. He was on the charities board. He had spent 30 years in the Canadian Army and was, by any reasonable metric, one of the most respected military figures in the country. He was looking at Tate Drummond the way people look at someone they owe something to. "I heard you're dealing with some trouble," Halloran said. Tate shook his head slightly. "Nothing I can't handle, sir. You always said that." Halloran put a hand on his shoulder. "You were usually right, but occasionally you needed somebody in your corner." "Still the case?" Tate looked at him for a moment. "Maybe." Halloran nodded. "Then you've got one." Laurel stepped back. She wasn't sure what she'd intended when she'd drifted in that direction, some instinct she hadn't examined. She turned and walked toward the coat check, and then stood there without getting her coat, her hand pressed flat against the marble counter. What she was feeling was not comfortable. It wasn't supposed to be. She had spent months treating Tate Drummond as a problem to be managed. She had been condescending in a restaurant in front of his daughter. She had sent offers she knew were inadequate because she'd assumed he'd take them, because she'd assumed he didn't have options, because she'd looked at his jacket and his hands in his salvage yard, and she had decided, without finding out a single thing about him, what he was worth. She had been wrong in the specific way that is hardest to recover from, which is when you're wrong about a person. She called his lawyer the next morning and asked for a meeting, not with both legal teams. Just the two of them, he agreed. She wasn't sure she deserved that. They met at the same restaurant on 8th Avenue. She'd chosen it deliberately, some instinct toward honesty she wasn't sure how to articulate otherwise. She was there first this time. She ordered coffee and waited, and when he came through the door and saw her across his face, not hostility, just readiness. He was always ready. He sat down. She said, "I owe you an apology." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, "not just for the negotiation, for what I said in this restaurant. Your daughter was there." He looked at her. She was. "I don't have an excuse for that," Laurel said. "I had made assumptions about you. They were wrong, and I said something in front of a child that—" She stopped. "I'm sorry." He held her gaze. "She asked me about it afterward," he said. "In the car, she asked me why that woman didn't want us there." Laurel felt that land where it was meant to land. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her that some people make up their minds before they have enough information, and that it's not about you. It's about them." He paused. She said, "Like when I think I don't like a food and I haven't even tried it?" And I said, "Yeah, kind of like that." Despite everything, Laurel felt the edge of a smile before she could stop it. "She sounds like a very pragmatic kid." "She is," Tate said. And there it was again, that smile, unguarded. "She gets it from her mother." The coffee came. They both looked at it for a moment. "What do you want out of this?" he asked. Not combatively. Just directly. "I want to find something that works," she said. "Actually works. Not just for Hartwell's timeline." He looked at her steadily. "That would be a change." "I know. I have a proposal," he said. "A real one. I had an engineer out last month. There's a configuration where the distribution hub can be built on the northern 30 acres without touching my operation. Rail spur access is actually better from that angle. I didn't bring it to the table before because I figured you'd find a way to use it against me." She felt that too. "Send it to me," she said. "I'll look at it without the lawyers first." He studied her face for a moment, taking the measure of her the way he probably took the measure of most things, carefully, without rushing, and then he said, "All right." The proposal was good. Better than good, actually. It was the kind of solution that she should have been looking for from the beginning if she hadn't been so focused on removing the obstacle instead of working around it. The engineer's assessment held up. She brought it to her senior VP, who looked at it for 40 minutes and then said, "Why didn't we have this 6 months ago?" She didn't answer that question out loud. The deal came together over the following weeks. Not smoothly. Nothing real comes together smoothly. But honestly, with both sides at the table, and the lawyers kept to their proper role of documenting rather than driving. There were 3 points where it almost fell apart. Each time, she called him directly, not through counsel, and they talked it through, and each time she came away from those conversations knowing a little more about what it meant to do the thing you'd built with your hands in the actual shape of your life. He came to know something about her too, though she wasn't sure what exactly. She wasn't the same person she'd been at that lunch counter in February. She wasn't sure yet who she was becoming. On the day the agreement was signed, she walked down to the lobby of the Hartwell building and found Tate there with Blythe, who had apparently been brought along because it was a school professional development day and her regular babysitter had a thing. Blythe was sitting on a lobby bench drawing in a small sketchbook, horses again, or possibly a horse with wings this time, and she looked up when Laurel approached. "I remember you," Blythe said. Laurel crouched down to her level. "I remember you too." "You said something mean," Blythe said, stating a fact, not an accusation, her father's directness exactly. "I did," Laurel said. "I was wrong to do that, I'm sorry." Blythe considered this with the full seriousness she gave everything. Then she held out her sketchbook. "Do you want to see my horse?" Laurel looked at the drawing. It was remarkably good for a 6-year-old, the proportions almost right, the lines confident. "She's beautiful. What's her name?" "Captain," Blythe said. "Because she's the boss." Tate, standing behind his daughter, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Laurel looked up at him. He was looking down at Blythe with an expression that was so undefended she felt like she was seeing something private, the whole of it, the thing he'd built his life around, right there in a lobby on a Thursday afternoon. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for both of them. He nodded once. The particular nod of a person who accepts acknowledgement without needing to make a production of it. She ran into him, 4 months later by accident, at the farmer's market on McLeod Trail. She was buying tomatoes she didn't need because she'd gone to the market without a list, which she never did, which probably said something about where her head was. He was 2 stalls over with Blythe, who was negotiating the purchase of something involving honey, the exact terms of which Laurel could not hear but which appeared to be quite serious. She almost turned the other way. Old instinct. Instead, she said his name. He looked over. Something in his face settled into something she'd only started recognizing recently. Ease, actual ease, the absence of readiness. "Nice tomatoes," he said. "I don't even need tomatoes," she said. "Then why? I have no idea." He looked at her for a moment. Then quietly, "There's good coffee at the end of the row. If you don't need anything else, you don't need." She looked at the tomatoes in her hand. She looked at him. "Okay," she said. Blythe appeared at his elbow, having concluded her honey negotiations successfully, holding a small jar like a trophy. She looked between the two adults with the unsettling perceptiveness of a child who misses very little. "Are you coming with us?" she asked Laurel. Laurel glanced at Tate. He was watching her with something patient and undemanding, the way he seemed to watch most things, like he had time, like the answer would arrive in its own shape and he was prepared to wait for it. "Yes," Laurel said. "I think I am." Blythe took her hand with straightforward confidence of someone who had made a decision and pulled her toward the end of the row. Tate walked beside them. The sun was out, the kind of sharp September sun that feels like it's trying to make up for something before the cold comes back. Laurel thought about the 6 months that had brought them here and all the ways she could have handled it differently from the beginning, and the strange particular grace of second chances that arrive in the shape of ordinary mornings. She didn't say any of that. Some things don't need to be said to be true. She just walked.